Friends, it is a good and a beautiful thing for us to be gathered in worship together. I'm so grateful that you're here. This is the third installment of our Found series, looking at the life of Moses and seeing what his story has to do with our story and our place of transition. I have this week and one more week left, so I get to preach this morning, and next week I'll be preaching for a final time here at Common Grace. And I got to say, it's such a bittersweet time. I'm so excited for what God is going to do through this community, through each one of you. What God is going to do with Pastor Mitch and his leadership on this community, and how it is that you're going to continue to represent the church to the world. I'm excited for what I'm moving into to the next pastoral call that I'll get to serve and what will happen there. But it's also, of course, very difficult to say goodbye and to move on. And so I'm really trying to savor all of these moments that we get to be together in worship, that we get to open the scriptures and reflect. And I'm grateful that you're a part of that. If you want to follow along with our scripture reading, we're going to jump into Exodus 16. I'm going to read a couple of verses at the beginning, and then I'll jump down to verse 9. So it goes something like this. The whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we had sat by the flesh pots and had our fill of bread. For you have brought us out here into the wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "I am going to rain bread from heaven for you, and each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day." Then jumping down to verse 9. Then Moses and Aaron said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the Israelites, draw near to the Lord, for God has heard your complaining." And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the Israelites, they looked towards the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, "I have heard the complaining of the Israelites. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall have your fill of bread, and then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." In the evening, quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the layer of dew lifted, there was a surface of the wilderness. On the surface of the wilderness was a fine flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, "It is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat." May God add blessing to our reading and understanding of these words. So over these last few weeks, if we've been looking at the story of Moses, we've seen some parts that are probably quite familiar, perhaps him being put in a basket and being rescued by Pharaoh's daughter, and some other scenes like that. But there's a lot of his story which is unknown. And this is a place that I think that we can find some informative things for us in our season, as Moses is now in a leadership role, has led the people out of Egypt, and their oppression, and out into this wilderness. They're in this midst of transition, as we are, and I think there's stuff for us to find in this text. So between Exodus 4, which is the furthest that we've read in this story, and Exodus 16, which is where we pick up today, a lot has happened. And in fact, the biblical writers sort of zoom in and go into great detail in what happens after Moses has sort of come to himself, as we talked about last week, and then been found by God, and then said, "You know what, I'd rather not do this thing," and finally ends up agreeing to do it. Some time passes, he goes to Egypt, and there is incredible, intricate detail in the conversation that happens between Pharaoh and Moses and God before finally the people escape through the sea into safety. And so the text would suggest that it's in the first 6 weeks after that's happened that we read this. And if you read verse 1 of Exodus 16, it says they're in the wilderness of sin. And by the way, if you read that, sometimes we think, wait a minute, is that supposed to be indicative of something? Sin in this case is actually just short for Sinai. So in the wilderness of Sinai, they find themselves, and that's where the story is at. And so they're somewhere between Elim, which is still wilderness, but is a bit of an oasis, and they're not yet to their next big milestone, which is Mount Sinai. They're in the Sinai wilderness on their way, but of course they're not exactly sure that's where they're going. And what happens in the midst of this first 6 weeks this season is they run out of basic necessities. And all of a sudden they begin to look around and they begin to say, what is it that we're doing here? Who brought us out here? And how is it that we're going to eat? How is it that we're going to drink? Where is our shelter going to come from? And they start to get upset. Now, sometimes we want to really wag our finger at these Israelites for their lack of faith. How could they see God do such an incredible thing and all of a sudden get angry with God and with Moses, who communicates with God? But they're hungry. And really that's how it happens. They're hangry and they're concerned, and they have legitimate concerns. And so they begin to get upset and they begin to grumble and they begin to wonder just what they've gotten themselves into. Have you ever known that moment as you have moved into or perhaps prepared to move into a new role, a new place, a new season, a new house, a new relationship, a new school? Have you ever been in that place where, as Donald Miller describes it, you have pushed out from the shore that is behind you, and when you look back, you can no longer see that shoreline getting any smaller, but the shoreline ahead of you, the place to where you're going, isn't getting any bigger? Have you ever been in that place where you begin to look around and say, wait a minute, where is this whole train going? And maybe it's in that place that the water starts to get choppy. And as you're paddling along, all of a sudden, the rhythm of that paddle sound or the pitter-patter of your feet, step after step after step, begins to become perhaps a little bit menacing, almost asking the question about whether you're really going anywhere, or perhaps whether you're really going anywhere that you want to go. Have you ever been in that place where you started on something and all of a sudden it was like, wait a minute, I don't think this is what I signed up for? Perhaps you realized that the task was more than you'd been advertised about, more than you'd imagined. Maybe you felt like you'd been sold a bill of goods, or you didn't think you were up for the task. Have you been in that place where you get frustrated because of all of this? Because you've been misled, because things aren't going to be quite as fun as you expected, because the pile of questions and concerns is seeming to grow bigger and bigger, but the pile of answers and benefits doesn't seem to be getting any larger. In that place, if you find yourself there now or another season, there's probably no better place to look in the scriptures than to the people of Israel as they are there in the wilderness on their exodus. Because what happens is over and over and over again, they find themselves in this place where they're like, what are we doing? And why did we agree to be brought out here? And what direction is this whole thing going anyway? Over and over, they find themselves in that place in the narrative. And they voice their concerns to Moses and to God. And over again, God responds, sometimes with frustration, but always by providing what they need. God provides with provision and with sustenance. In fact, you could say that the entire story of Exodus has the recurring theme that God is the provider of all good and perfect gifts. That God provides even for those who neither expect it and for those who don't recognize it when it's happening and in the process. That's how Thomas de Gaulle describes it, is that Exodus is this story of the God who provides over and over again for a people who can be quite finicky. Friends, this is such a good reminder for us right now in the season that we find ourselves in. For we are in a season of transition and we're moving into an unknown future. We're already knee-deep into this change, and there are only a few more answers than when we first waded out into the water. We need to remind ourselves, and we need to be reminded of God's faithfulness in moments like this, because sometimes we get to this point and we can get disoriented, we can get off track, we can get ourselves lost if we don't stay the course. So when you find yourself in one of those places where you're looking around thinking that this is going to be more challenging than I signed up for or than I was prepared for, or when it feels like progress isn't coming as fast or in the forms that you would like, what is it that you do to remind yourself of God's faithfulness in those moments? Is it music, listening to it or singing it? Is it scripture? Is it meditation or prayer? Do you find a conversation with a trusted mentor? When you're in those places where you find yourself wandering and not sure of where you're going, what is it that moors you, that grounds you, that brings you back into connection and reminder of God's faithfulness? Wrestle with that question this week. Here's what happens though. Sometimes the reminders that we want and the affirmation that we want from God, sometimes those provisions that God provides and those gifts that God provides, they don't come on the timeline that we're expecting, or they don't come in the forms that we anticipate. They don't come in the ways that we want them to. I was thinking about the reading this week, and one has to assume, now I'm treading on thin ice here because I'm going to assume about the mind of God. But I'm going to go ahead and say that God had a plan when God called the people out of Egypt about how God was going to feed them in the midst of the wilderness. So I'm going to assume that this bread that comes down from heaven that we call the manna that God provides, this fine flaky substance our reading says from Exodus, that God had a plan to provide that from the very beginning, from the time that God called the people. I'm going to assume that's true. And I'm going to assume that God planned to provide the quails to the people. By the way, let's talk a little bit about what's going on there. So in the mornings, they wake up and there's this dew, and when it evaporates, there's this fine flaky bread that they can bake and they can cook and they can use to eat and to survive, and it's sweet, and it provides them the bread that they need so that they can keep on going. The quail, I one time heard a pastor who talked about, if you imagine that the Israelite camp was so many people and that it was filled with quails to a certain point, the scriptures say elsewhere, like there was quail upon quail upon quail. And he said, if you take all of that and you do the math and then you figure out the volume of an average quail, it would be this many millions of quail a day. It's quite an interesting little bit of Bible math. I don't have it all memorized, but the point is that there is this meat coming, and meat was almost a luxury in this time. And the Israelites are getting that even in the wilderness where the quail shouldn't be. That's what God is doing. That's what's going on, is God is providing as God has promised. And so I'm going to assume that God had planned to do that from the very beginning. Later, Moses will strike a rock and the people will receive water. I'm going to assume that God had a plan for the people to receive water when God called them out of Egypt. So let's assume that there's a plan. Evidently, things weren't coming to fruition. That plan wasn't being realized fast enough for the people of Israel, because they're hungry and they're confused and they're scared. And when we get into that place where we realize we're in a little bit over our heads and this is going to be a bigger task and journey that we thought, we have that tendency to get disoriented and to get off track and to get fearful and to get angry and hangry. And I think that's what happens to the Israelites. And here's what's interesting, is that assuming God planned all of that from the beginning, they get their gift as God had planned. They get their provision, but they seem to have angered God in the process. Again, quoting from Stigall, who I mentioned earlier, the manna and the quail are God's providential, if peeved, response to the emergent and legitimate need of the people. The provision is surely premeditated, but their hurry and their murmuring has ruined the party. Their hurry and their murmuring has ruined the party. You know, that phrase got me thinking this week. Have you ever had a gift coming to you? Maybe you knew that it was coming, or maybe you didn't. And somehow you managed to tarnish the gift, or the giving and the receiving of the gift, by your hurry, by your murmuring, or by your grumbling. Or let's flip it. Have you ever been somebody who was going to give a gift to somebody? Maybe you were really, really excited to give it. But then they seemed to complain about things, their attitude changed, they felt entitled, and all of a sudden you found that you just had a little bit less joy in giving that gift to somebody else. I remember as a kid, my parents having ordered a gift for me. It was a special gift. We got to pick it out together. I'd wanted it for a long time, and it was going to be perfect. Now, this was back in the days before you had Prime shipping and you could get anything in the world that you possibly wanted delivered to your door in 4 hours. And I don't know how long it took, but I know that as a child, it was taking way too long. And so I began to murmur and to grumble, and I would ask my parents, is it here yet? Is it here yet? And I would ask them multiple times a day, and it seemed like it was taking forever. To my juvenile self, was it ever going to arrive? And I began to get upset, and I worked myself into a tizzy, and I got frustrated. And here's the deal. Even though I knew this thing was coming, it wasn't coming fast enough for me. And I grew in obnoxiousness over time. And what happened is that in the process, I think I sort of wore myself out. So that when I finally received it, I was happy to receive it, but it didn't have quite as much joy to it. It felt more like something that I'd just been missing out on for too long. It was like some of the joy was tarnished by my complaining. And I can only imagine that it was notably less exciting for my parents to give it to me when it finally arrived, because they had heard me incessantly whining about it all the time. Maybe we've done the same thing. I don't know if you've ever had somebody throw a party for you, maybe a going away party or a shower or something like that. And what I can tend to do, I don't know if you do this at all, is that I can tend to sort of over control those things. And so that's like a gift that somebody gives you that's not a physical, tangible thing, but it's a gift like hosting a party. And when you need to control every aspect of that, what it does is it takes a lot of the fun out of the surprise that's intended to be for you, and it takes a lot of fun and a lot of joy out of the experience of those who are trying to provide and do that thing for you. Maybe you've been so fixated on a final product at some point in your life that you don't enjoy the growth and the development that comes with it. Here's what happens in those moments. The substance of the gift doesn't change, but what does change is the experience of the giving and the receiving. So if we assume that God had a plan to provide manna and quail to the people all along, but that the people worked themselves up and got frustrated with God and said bad things about Moses and God, and if we assume that God gets frustrated because of that, then what we can assume is that at a base level, everything happens as expected, but at a deeper level, there's some hurt feelings along the way. This is really, really important. Not only because we have things that we wait for in life, but because we find ourselves in a season of transition. And what can happen in seasons of transition is that we can want clarity so badly. We can want to know where we're going and what we're moving into so badly. And by the way, what the weather looks like when we get there, that it really tarnishes the experience. As with so much of life, we're harried and we're hurried moving from one thing to the next. And we want not only some assurance and some clarity and some specificity that things will be okay and that God will be with us. We want to know what it looks like for things to be okay and for God to be with us in the place that we're going to. And we want to be clear about all of those things right now, and we're tempted to rush from one feeling of sure footing to another feeling of sure footing. And if we have to wait, we murmur against the necessity of waiting. And in so doing, what we do is we partially tarnish the gift that always was and always is going to be given anyway, but we're no better for the wear because of it. Do you understand what I'm saying? In the midst of transition, like the Israelite people who get frustrated and upset and probably say things that they don't mean, who get disoriented in the midst of that place where the shoreline before isn't getting smaller and the one ahead isn't getting bigger, who get off track, what happens is they lose sight of the promise and the provision that God always provides, and they begin to grumble, and it changes their hearts and their spirits in the midst of it. And we can do the very same thing when we find ourselves in places of transition. And so for us, friends, perhaps it would be good for me, for sure, and maybe for you to take a good and a deep breath and to do whatever that thing is we said earlier that helps remind you of God's faithfulness, and to move forward patiently and with joyful expectation. There's one last thing that I want to talk about in this text. And this was the line of scripture that finally solidified for me that I wanted to talk about Moses in these last few weeks together. It was from the last verse that we read. It went like this: when the Israelites saw the manna, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. Over these last couple of months, one of the things that I've been doing is looking back over the years that we've shared together as Common Grace, thinking all the way back to when I lived in Wichita, and this was nothing more than an idea, and Common Grace didn't have a name, and I didn't know what it would look like. And what I've been doing is I was thinking about all of those things and wondering, what was it that I walked by like a little burning bush? What was it that I walked by or that I saw and I didn't know what it was, so I just kept moving on? What was it that I saw that was maybe a gift from God, a provision, a promise, some blessing that I didn't recognize in the moment. And friends, what I want to challenge you to do is to think about that for you. There have been so many great experiences. There have been so many people who have stepped up in various ways at various times, sometimes just for a season, sometimes for a really long time. There have been relationships that have been forged and small groups that have been formed that have done incredible things. There's been community outreach and connections. And what I want to encourage you to do is to think about those things. Think about ways that you've contributed or just things that you've witnessed that maybe you passed by at the time, but perhaps was some sort of blessing from God, some sort of promise fulfilled that would cause us to say, what is that? But if we thought about it more, we might realize it was a gift from God. I want to just give one example of the way that happened in sort of repeated fashion from the very beginning of Common Grace. So when this idea began to emerge that this was going to happen, I assumed that we would meet in a school, because that's what all the other church starts that I knew did. And so we called one school district, and when they finally got back to me, they said, all of our schools in the area that you're looking at are full. And I said, okay. So I called a different school district, and they said, we don't allow churches to meet in our school, which I'm not sure that was true, but that's what they said. I called two other school districts who didn't even answer my phone calls. And so I was really in a place of scrambling, and somewhere along the line, we got connected to the Ball Conference Center, and through somebody who was a member at Grace, we were able to have a conversation and begin to think about what it would mean for Common Grace to meet at the Ball Conference Center. And here's the deal. This wasn't expected, but it was so good. I think part of what it did is it helped us break out of whatever mold that I had set for myself, a clear path of where we were going to go, and said that we're going to have to allow God and the Holy Spirit to work in the midst of this thing that we're doing together. What it did was open doors to partnership. So it meant that we would build a partnership with KVC and help support families that are fostering kids here in our area and across the state. And that came because of our physical location. It looked different because we couldn't adopt a school that we were in, and that's something that people do a lot. But it gave us that opportunity to partner with some of the most vulnerable people in our community. It put us right next door to a retirement community where we could flip mattresses and build relationships and host Easter egg hunts. It gave us accessibility and a front door that was unintimidating. Actually, it gave us a front door that was really fun because the students, the kids, and some of the pastors like to spin round and round and round in the revolving door. I remember the first time that Pastor Nanette came and looked at that place, she said, this may be the first time in the history of all church starts that people are going to be disappointed when we move from this building because it's so nice into whatever the next thing would be. And I remember the ways that we were able to host events there that we wouldn't have been able to do at a school, and the ways that we were able to invite people into that place that we couldn't. And when the pandemic was beginning to loosen its grip, we were able to meet when schools weren't allowing anybody in. And I think about all of the ways that became a blessing that were unexpected, and the ways that we were able to build partnerships. And I think about this question that came to my mind at the very beginning, which was, what does that look like? It looked like God in the midst of us working to take this situation and do good and beautiful things and build partnerships. And there have been all sorts of examples of that have happened all along the way. We could look at our Christmas adventures. From that very first candlelight community service that happened at the Olathe Community Center that went a little bit different than I expected, and there was a lot of hiccups going into it, and I wasn't sure that it was worthwhile until somebody came up to me, a mother in tears, and said, you know, my children won't walk through the doors of a church no matter what I do to them, but I got to have a Christmas service with them, and I'm so incredibly grateful, and thank you for doing this. And there was other stories like that night. But it left us thinking, which invited us to build a partnership with KC Wine Co., in which we had one idea and they had another idea, and we merged them, and it turned into something really incredible called the Living Nativity. And there was people there that night who said, I can't believe that a church would come and partner here in this place and put this program on here. And it was an incredible experience. And then there was a pandemic. And we moved it onto the campus, the Ridgeview campus, and we held it outside, and people socially distanced, and there was a line like 18 miles long, I swear, and there was people that came out of the woodwork and came out of nowhere, and they were so happy to be outside on a freezing cold day, to be gathered at a safe distance in community, to have something that celebrated the season in the midst of a really, really hard season. And then the Living Nativity evolved again and again, and who knows what it will look like in the future, and who knows if it'll even happen or if that energy will get turned into something different. I don't know, that's up to you to decide, but I think about the ways that it was not a clear path from there to here, but somehow God has been working along the way, and when we look back, it's kind of like you can say, maybe God's hand was even in the midst of that. So where's that been true for you? As we're in this season of transition for Common Grace and looking ahead and looking forward to something new, where has that happened in your life? And if you're finding it hard to name those things, if you're finding that maybe you're in the midst of that in-between and you're tempted to get off track, go back to those practices that help remind you of the faithfulness of God. Maybe sit down with someone who you know from Common Grace or somebody that you trust, and allow yourself to be reminded of God's goodness and God's faithfulness. And see if you can mine those experiences, those ones that caught us off guard and made us say, what was that? Could it be that was the gift and the promise and the provision of God? Could it be that was where we found God in the midst of our journey? Let's take a few moments for reflection.